Hola a todos, mi nombre es María Martí, soy la presidenta del Ayn Rand Center para América Latina. Quiero darles la bienvenida a este primer curso que organiza el centro conjuntamente con ThinkSpot y con Stephen Hicks. El nombre del primer curso es Nietzsche versus Rand sobre altruismo y egoísmo, en donde vamos a explorar las similitudes entre estos dos intelectuales, pero fundamentalmente las diferencias que hay entre ellos en sus nociones de altruismo y de egoísmo. Este es un curso que tendrá 3 sesiones. Hoy comenzamos con la primera, en donde Stephen Hicks se enfocará en el tema del altruismo. La segunda sesión es el sábado que viene, el sábado 27 de junio, donde enfocaremos en el tema del egoísmo. Y la última sesión es el 4 de julio, en donde haremos una sesión de Q&A, en donde los participantes podrán hacer todas las preguntas que les hayan quedado sobre este curso. Stephen Hicks es Ph.D. en filosofía, es profesor de la Universidad de Rockford y autor de varios libros, entre ellos Explicando el posmodernismo y Nietzsche y los nazis. Así que comenzamos con este curso. Thank you, Stephen Hicks, for being here. Welcome, and the audience is for you.
All right, thank you. Let me slow this down just for a moment. Well, let me return the thanks to Ayn Rand Center Latin America for the invitation, and to ThinkSpot, and those two organizations jointly worked out this topic that's strong in my mind and near in my heart to giant thinkers on the intellectual landscape. And I'm going to say both of them now have inspired millions of people across many generations. And I think most of us, when we first come to the issues of egoism and altruism, it's the kind of romantic, adventuresome sense of life that both Nietzsche and Rand share that I think, particularly when we are younger, we find so attractive. So what I want to do is start by going through a few of the quotations that I take as indicative of this very romantic sense of life that is that's very appealing. So here is Ayn Rand saying, quote, "Do not, right, let your fire go out, spark by irreplaceable spark in the hopeless swamps of the not quite, the not yet, and the not at all. Do not let the hero in your soul perish in lonely frustration," and so on. The world you desire can be won. And those of us who are young with our whole lives ahead, but nonetheless sensing that there's a certain amount of decay and hypocrisy out there in the world, these remarks are encouraging, if not inspirational. We find similar rhetoric when we turn to Friedrich Nietzsche. Here, I like to imagine someone after a long climb up to the top of a mountain, and it's been hard work, but as they get to the top, the sun breaks out and they're confronted with a lovely vista, and Nietzsche's words, "One emerges again and again into the light. One experiences again and again one's golden hour of victory. And then one stands forth as one was born, unbreakable, tensed, ready for new, even harder, remoter things, like a bow that distress serves to draw tauter." Now, at the same time, for all of the inspiring rhetoric that Rand and Nietzsche both share, they are able to put their fingers on what we call button-pushing issues in the history of philosophy. And one mark of their staying power has been the fact that they have identified fundamental issues, that they have stated clearly what their alternatives are, as well as whom they take their deep philosophical enemies to be. And seeing philosophy and intellectual life in part in martial terms, like a battle. Both Nietzsche and Rand are warriors in the ongoing fight for what they take to be good ideas, and their utmost distaste and often disgust for the ideas that they think are false and damaging. So Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, is one of the, if not the best name caller in the history of philosophy. And one of the things that's striking about him and Rand is that both of them share very important philosophical enemies. So Plato in the upper left on the screen, Nietzsche calls him a coward, right, before reality. It's not just that he was wrong in postulating this other world of beautiful, perfect forms and longing to escape to it, that just amounts to a moral failing of cowardice. He doesn't like the messy, sometimes ugly world that we live in, and he wants to flee from it. And that's a kind of an unmanly cowardice that Plato was manifesting. Christianity in the upper right corner here. He labels Christians and the entire kind of religious tradition of which Christianity is a prominent example as, again, being something that comes from a low place, the kind of people who crawl along the grounds, and he labels them as crawling beings in rebellion to everything that has height. And so we're supposed to think of insects and other low-like creatures and so forth that just don't want to actually stand up and be men or be human beings in the best possible sense. Immanuel Kant, whom Nietzsche has mixed views on, but very often his strong distaste for Kant comes out. He calls him a catastrophic spider. Of course, that's a perfect metaphor for Kant's more rationalistic, spinning webs of words and building elaborate structures that are floating in the air. But at the same time, this sense of spiders as being things that like to find crevices in dark places, and that's really where Kant likes to hang out. And in disgust with the widespread socialism and leveling egalitarianism and the idea that somehow we're supposed to think everybody is equal and equally deserving of praise and blame and so forth. And along comes a welfare state, or even a more robustly socialist state that's going to give us things and look after us and tell us what to do. Nietzsche labels it the coldest of all cold monsters. So in addition to their positive, soaring, adventure, romantic rhetoric, what we find in Nietzsche and Rand is a common set of enemies whom they are both vigorously attacking. And one of the questions that's striking is how they both blend psychological acuity with philosophical depth. And in many cases, what is most prominent is Nietzsche and Rand both trying to understand why so many people don't live up to their potential. In fact, so many people seem to betray their potential and become cowards and conformists in various ways. Where does this come from? And if you have this strong sense that human beings can be magnificent and lead awesome lives, why do so many individuals seem to have betrayed that? So the weakness, this willingness to obey and go along, or in some cases, this kind of felt need, right, to obey, and being envious and filled with resentment at other people. Nietzsche is very careful and perceptive in his diagnosis of that. And we find very similar themes in Rand. Why are so many people conformists, or in her language, second-handers? They don't have their own firsthand sense of judgment and create a vision about what they believe and what their life is going to be about. They just copy, and they seem unable or unwilling to try to go out on their own. And as a result, of course, they feel inside that they've betrayed their lives in some sense, that they're not living up to what they want to be. And so they become resentful at life. And of course, they are resentful of other people who are in fact going off and doing something fairly special in their lives. And sometimes I'm tempted to say this is an overstatement, that the Fountainhead, Rand's first novel that reached millions of people, is in some ways a deeper novel than Atlas Shrugged, because Atlas Shrugged's themes are more focusing on political and economic decay, whereas the Fountainhead is much more focused on moral and psychological issues. And it's an interesting question that the Fountainhead is raising, because even in a society like the one she saw in contemporary United States in the 1930s and the early 1940s when she was writing the novel, a relatively free society, people can do whatever they want. They're encouraged to be to be entrepreneurs and artists and go seek their dreams and so on. But so many people, despite having political freedom and a huge amount of economic freedom, they seem to betray it. So it's more of a cultural issue or a psychological issue or a moral issue that's underlying the political and economic issues that she later draws attention to. So, of course, people who are smart and iconoclastic and putting their fingers on very deep issues and putting hard and calling other people names and attacking them in no uncertain terms, we can expect a certain amount of blowback. And another thing that's striking about the similarity between Rand and Nietzsche in their trajectories is that the philosophers of their generations returned the favor and were typically dismissive and obstructionist with respect to them. So I'm charmed by this quotation from one of Nietzsche's biographers about when Nietzsche was a young professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Apparently the philosophy professors there did not like him. They didn't really think he was a philosopher, and they actually went out of their way to urge their students not to take courses with with Nietzsche. He's not a real intellectual. He's not a real philosopher. Stay away from that guy. Take courses from us. We've got it all worked out. Now, of course, it's a bit of Schadenfreude perhaps, but we don't remember the names of who these semi-competent philosophers were back in 1870s in Switzerland, while now, of course, we understand Nietzsche's true stature on the intellectual landscape. And it's a similar thing with respect to Rand. Rand has been widely seen as an iconoclastic thinker in the American tradition, but professional philosophers and professional political philosophers have been often dismissive of her, and for her to find a place in the intellectual canon has been a hard-fought battle. So this is an example from Alan Bloom, who also was alive at the same time that Rand was alive, teaching at the University of Chicago. And at this point, he's just talking about his students and asking them what books they read. But then when students mention Ayn Rand, he becomes immediately dismissive and condescending. And as it says here, well, there's always this girl in my class, right, who mentions Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, a book, though hardly literature, which with its sub-Nietzschean assertiveness excites somewhat eccentric youngsters rather to a new way of life. So it's kind of a triple whammy against Rand, right? Her great selling perceptive novels, oh, that's not really literature, right? Her philosophy is not even up to the level of Nietzsche, it's sub-Nietzschean. And then there's got to be something really wrong with people who find themselves attracted to her views, particularly young people. They're just weird. And so we dismiss them. But nonetheless, both Rand and Nietzsche are deep. And in this first lecture, the first of two, I want to focus on their critiques of altruism. Next week, when we return, I want to turn to the positive and their advocacies of egoism. And of course, the great battle between egoism and altruism is one of the major issues in moral philosophy. But in this case, I want to drill down to a study of what's similar and what's different in Rand's and Nietzsche's understandings of altruism. And while I do think there is a great deal of overlap, Nietzsche, of course, was a generation or two earlier than Rand. Rand read Nietzsche. She was influenced early on by his, and even in her mature works, her analyses of altruism, there's a lot of overlap with territory that Nietzsche had staked out early on. But then at the same time, I do want to argue that on some very fundamental issues that feed into understanding their criticisms of altruism, there are some very deep differences, and not to give away too much, those deep differences by the time you turn to the positive, the other side. It's one thing to have some common enemies and some shared premises and attacking some common enemies, but those deeper differences become very important when you compare Nietzsche and Rand's positive alternatives. So Nietzsche, 19th century, 1844, died in 1900. He actually died intellectually around 1890 or so. But one of his famous phrases, of course, is the idea that God is dead. And by this, he doesn't mean that there actually was a God who has now died and passed away. What he means is that the ideas of religion as a belief system and as a set of principles to guide our character formation and our actions, that particularly in the modern world, we don't believe that anymore. And even if we are religious, it's very hard for us in the modern world to have the same level of religiosity that people in the pre-modern world did. We are much more rational, we're much more scientific, we're much more individualistic in our thinking. And this is having huge intellectual and cultural impacts on us. And of course, this has huge impacts on how we think about morality, because much of traditional religious morality had been to say that morality is something that is written on some tablets that were handed to this guy who died a few thousand years ago. And we are just supposed to accept on faith that these words were as dictated by God. God is the supreme commander. We're not supposed to at all question or think about. We're just supposed to accept these commandments and obey them. So God is the legislator. We follow on the basis of faith and we do not question. We are just obedient and faithful and so forth. But then if God is dead, then what this means is that religion is not true. And that means that its whole approach to morality is true. And then we have to start saying, question, well, if there really is no God, then where do our morals come from? And where does religion come from? And the answer has to be that in some sense, we made up religion and we made up morality. And so when we start to study religions and all the different kinds of religions, they are projections of their founders, that is to say, the human beings who made them up. And so what Nietzsche then becomes very interested in is looking at moral codes and moral systems and religious systems, not as being about truth and are they really true or not. That's an old question for him. But in terms of the question, what does advocating this kind of moral system or advocating this religious system say about the kind of person who would actually believe that or who would make that up? So what button psychologically is this religion pushing in the person, right? Or what is that person trying to accomplish by advocating this religion and expecting other people to follow along? Now, this ties into this question about weakness and conformity and people betraying their human potential, because Nietzsche is, of course, struck by the fact that so many people find religion attractive and that it is serving some sort of a need, particularly certain sorts of religions that go out of their way to try to get you to say that you are a weak person. You are a sinful person. You should be ashamed of who you are. All of your natural desires, you should be trying to suppress those. And you should feel guilty if you indulge all of those. And what you really need to do is go down on your knees and feel unworthy and look up to your betters, the priests, and look up to God. And maybe even prostrate yourself completely on the ground and press your face into the dirt. And then the question is going to be, what kind of person, right, would accept that? Where is their kind of natural human dignity or your natural human pride that says, no, that's not me. I'm not going to do that. And how dare you ask me to do this sort of thing? So where does this widespread attraction of this come from? And of course, we can say, well, people are just born into a religious tradition and they've got some powerful authority figures in their lives, their parents and teachers and priests and so forth. And these priests tell them that this is what they're supposed to do. But we do know that lots of kids, they have their own mind. Their parents say, eat your vegetables. And the kid says, no, I'm not going to eat my vegetables. I don't like my vegetables. So why are they willing to push back on that sort of thing? And they have their own musical tastes and their own ways that they want to dress and they want to do their own things and they don't want to be told what to do. You're not the boss of me. But so many kids will go along and they will let their kind of natural human dignity or their natural human pride be subverted. So we could say that, but that's still kind of a puzzle. Or of course, it could just be that there's something about them, that they're just born that way and that they don't really have any dignity. And so they're willing to go along with it. So why do we have so many people who seem to be different? Others who have their sense of pride and dignity, and those who don't have their pride and dignity. And of course, there's another kind of person, they don't really feel guilty and ashamed, but they recognize that most people in their social circle accept this religion. So they mouth the words and they go along with it. But even there's a question, why go along with it? Why can't you stand up for yourself and say, hey, maybe this religion is a little bit overboard. Maybe we should be more human affirming. So it's a great puzzle. And then, of course, the big question is, even if you really believe that there is a God, and God is the way so many of these religions tell us, that he's very powerful, and he's angry, and fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and you should feel like a speck of nothingness in the presence of God and be willing to fall down, and God wants you to be absolutely obedient to him. So suppose there really is a God like that. Well, why wouldn't the natural human being be the same kind of reaction that we would have to any sort of tyrant, right, who comes along and just wants us to submit? That maybe that tyrant's power would make us to go along, but secretly we're saying this guy is a wicked tyrant and I'm going to resist him as much as we possibly can. Now, what Nietzsche is going to argue is that the answer to this question really is biological. Religion and religious moral codes are not really a matter of truth. There really isn't a God. There really aren't moral commandments written in the stars or written on stone tablets out there. It's not an issue of truth. Rather, our moral codes are a psychological projection that we are a certain kind of being, and that what the moral codes are doing is formalizing in explicit conscious terms what our psychological predispositions are, and that our psychology itself, though, is to a large extent biologically preconditioned in us. And there are different kinds of human beings out there. So I have a quotation here from Nietzsche's famous work, right, Beyond Good and Evil, where he says, quote, "It cannot be effaced." That is to say, to take the face off of something, or erased, right, from a man's soul, right, your psyche, what's in your soul. It cannot be effaced from a man's soul what his ancestors have preferably and most constantly done. That then is to say, your ancestors lived a certain way. They had a certain biological and cultural mode of life, and that, so to speak, became baked into who they are. And then through reproduction, you came into the world, but you are born with all of these biological predispositions. You inherit them from your ancestors, and they then manifest in your psyche as a certain type of psychology. And given the kind of psychology you have, certain kinds of moral principles are going to feel right and seem right to you. So here's another pair of quotations, also one from Beyond Good and Evil. One's moral code is a, quote, decisive witness to who he is, unquote, to the, quote, innermost drives of his nature. That is to say, it's a subjective, it's inside you. You already have a nature with drives or instincts, and those manifest themselves in conscious explicit form. So it's not at all a matter of any sort of objective out there moral principles or moral truths that we are going to discover. It's a subjective, biologically driven or biopsychologically driven process. And you'll notice in this next quotation, this is from The Will to Power, a collection of notes Nietzsche was working on before he reached the end of his productive work life, where he says here, moral judgments are symptoms, right? They're not causes, right, of actions. They are symptoms, right? And sign languages, right? It's just a sign language, which is to say it's a symbol of something underlying. Symptoms and sign languages which betray the process of physiological prosperity or failure. So it's a physiological matter. Now notice also the normative terms tacked on the end there, prosperity or failure. Because of course, one of the things that's true about morality is that there are different moral codes that are out there. And Nietzsche is going to argue that some of them are healthier and some of them are sicker. But the reason some are healthier and some of them are sicker is that they are symptoms of or expressions of different physiological natures. Some of us are physiologically healthy. We are physiologically prosperous. And so on the basis of that, a certain kind of moral code is going to manifest itself. Others of us are physiologically failure. We're weak. We don't have our acts together. We are sick. We are unhealthy in various ways. And a different kind of moral code is going to be a manifestation of that. Now, I mentioned Nietzsche as a 19th century thinker. Evolution thinking is, of course, prominent. Nietzsche was born in 1844. Charles Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859. So that means that Nietzsche is coming of age in the first generation that Origin of Species is being taken seriously as a bombshell exploding all over Europe and afar. But he, as many authors do, then likes to give biological and animal comparisons and metaphors. So notice what he says here about lambs and birds of prey. Okay? Quote, this is from Genealogy of Morals, another work, that lambs dislike birds of prey, right, does not seem strange. Only it gives no grounds for reproaching those birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. So here what we have is prey species, lambs. And what are lambs like? Well, they're small, they're scared, they like to stay in the herd, they want the shepherd or they want the, their mom and dad and the bigger sheep to look after them. And they definitely don't want to go out into the big world because out in the world, it's very scary out there. There's wolves. And if you look up in the sky, right, there's all of these predator birds of prey, right, and so forth. And what is it to be good? Well, it's to good is to be like me. It's like to be a lamb, and those birds of prey, they're bad, right, and so forth. And if the lambs say among themselves, right, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good? Well, there's no reason to find fault with this. I'm going to pause there in the quotation. Nietzsche is then saying, well, it's perfectly natural for a lamb with its particular biology and its psychology to think being like a lamb is good and behaving like a lamb, that's good. And anything that's opposite to that or threatens my lamb lifestyle, that's bad. So therefore, the birds of prey and wolves and any other predator species, those are bad, those are evil, and so forth. But then, of course, you have to switch perspective to the birds of prey perspective. And as Nietzsche puts it here with a little irony, perhaps the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb, unquote. And then, of course, is to say from the bird of prey perspective, different physiology, different psychology at work. You are a predator species. What's good and what's bad to you is going to be completely different. So just as what's good or bad is relativized across the animal kingdom, Nietzsche is then going to draw the analogy and say the same thing holds for human beings. There is a predator prey or more sheep-like disposition that many human beings have, and other human beings have much more of a predator type disposition. And so what's going to happen is different moral codes are going to be expressions of that. And one history of morality then is to understand the difference between those two. So what Nietzsche then wants to argue is what we should not be doing is what religion tells us, that there's one set of moral codes, that God has announced it, or any sort of objectivist or intrinsicist understanding moral theory, that there's one universal set of values that are just true and objectively verifiable out there in nature somehow. Instead, what Nietzsche wants to argue is we need to not take them for granted. We need to, quote, critique moral values. The value of the values themselves must first be called into question. So the question is not, is the moral code true or is it factual, but what's the value of it, or what's the use of it, right? What values is it serving? And for that, there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. So moral codes came into existence by certain sorts of beings in certain circumstances. They weren't for once and for all written in the sky and laid upon us. And so there are different circumstances, different kinds of beings in different circumstances, and so we should expect different moral codes, and that's how we're going to study morality. Now, there are lots of versions of this. There's political morality, there's religious morality, and in many cases we see similar struggles going on, power struggles, different kinds of codes of idealism and realism and so forth. But Nietzsche also, he trained as a classical philologist, and his Ph.D. was in the study of classical languages. And as a result of that, he is enormously well-versed in ancient history. And one of the things that strikes him is how moral language has changed and evolved over time. And so what he wants us to do, those of us who are living in the contemporary Western world, he's a 19th century figure, and he's noticing that in the 19th century, while of course, many people are thrilling to the idea of there are some people who are just awesome, who are magisterial and magnificent, and perhaps geniuses, awesome athletes and musicians and poets, and perhaps some politicians and business figures and so forth. And we look up to them and we admire them. And we recognize that some people are kind of weak and contemptible. So we do all of that language where we sort people out along this hierarchical, right, perspective. But at the same time, we have another moral language that's prominent in the 19th century, and Nietzsche is worried that it's becoming even more prominent and is perhaps going to take over, that says things like, we're all weak, we're all equal, nobody is better than anybody else, we should all share, those who have a little bit more should give up and be selfless for the sake of those who are less than themselves. And so we are totally focused on the weaker and feeling pity, and there can be those of us who are stronger and who have a little more, we should feel guilty and be a little bit ashamed, right, about that. So we have these two competing moral codes. Where did this collision come from, and why are they both prominent in our culture? And of course, he's going to call the first the master moral code, and the second he's going to call the slave moral code. And he uses the language of slavery and an ensuing moral code, drawing from his historical use of the ancient Egyptians at a very important time for Western civilization, at the beginnings of Western civilization, when the ancient Hebrews or the ancient Israelites were slaves under the Egyptians. Now, at that point, the Egyptians were, to use Nietzschean language, kind of a master morality, or they were a master power. They had risen up, they had imposed their will upon the world. Those who had clawed their way to the top of the hierarchy lived the life of their dreams, and they made everybody else do their bidding, including a huge number of slaves at the bottom of the pyramid. But at the same time, we then have to turn our attention to the slaves. And the interesting thing is, from Nietzsche's perspective, that the slaves had to find a way to survive. And so what he wants to argue is that what's good or bad is that which is going to enable you to survive in the actual conditions that you find yourself in. So at this pregnant moment in Jewish history, right, or ancient Semitic or ancient Israeli history, what we find is a group of people who find themselves as slaves. Now, what you can do, of course, is try to be a normal human being. And you say, if you're a normal human being, well, I've got my own ideas. I've got my own will. I've got my own goals. I want to grow up and live my life the way I want to live my life. And so natural morality would say I should get as much power as I can and try to assert myself in the world, because that's how I'm going to affirm my humanity and live the best kind of life that I possibly can. But the problem is, if you are actually a slave and you try to live that way, you are going to be damaged, because the masters have power over you and they will do damage to you. They will beat you. They will whip you. They will subject you to all sorts of privations, and they will kill you. So the problem is, you cannot survive the way a natural or normal human being wants to survive. Instead, what you have to do is, if you're at all intelligent, is realize you need a different kind of code. What you need to do is train yourself to stifle all of your natural human drives. You have your own opinion. Well, you learn to stifle, be silent. Don't state your own opinion. You are struck by the master because you did something, or maybe you didn't do anything, and the master is just completely being unjust and just hitting you for whatever reason. Naturally, as a human being, you want revenge and you want to strike back, but you can't take revenge. You have to find a way to internalize it. And make that go down, push it down inside yourself. Otherwise, if you express that, you are going to be harmed. You want to go off and do your things, but the master has told you to stand over there and wait on him. Well, you have to learn how to be patient. So you have to learn how to stifle yourself, how to be forgiving, how to be patient, and of course, how to be obedient. Those are, in fact, the virtues or the character traits that, to the extent that you are able to make yourself believe them and act that way, is going to keep you alive. And if you don't do those things, you are going to die or suffer. And if you are a slave and you have children, what you will then do is make great effort to teach your children those slave virtues. Be patient, be forgiving, don't take revenge, be silent, be obedient above all, because you want your children to survive. So what Nietzsche then is saying is that this was a decisive moment in ancient history, because here we had a group of people who developed a new code, a new moral code that did in fact enable them to survive slavery. Any slaves who weren't able to do that, they got killed. So, but this is psychologically interesting, Nietzsche is saying, because all of our natural human energy, we want to externalize it, we want to discharge it. But what we find here is that all of that natural human energy has to be suppressed and internalized. And so this quotation, the outward discharge of the instincts was inhibited and turned backward against man himself. Now, pause for a moment. Nietzsche is saying we naturally like to be hostile and cruel, and we take joy in persecuting and attacking, right, and all of these things, but we can't do any of those things. So all of that, we have to turn it back inside ourselves. And what he wants to then say is that this poisons our psyche, it poisons our conscience, and we become a different kind of being inside, but very interesting beings inside. So to the extent that you have a certain amount of will, a certain amount of human energy that you want to externalize it, but as a result of your situation and the training that you have received as the inheritance of a certain inheritor, rather, of a certain moral tradition, you're going to have this huge struggle going on inside yourself. And that's going to result in some pretty nasty psychology. And so in this case, Nietzsche wants to say, out of this religious tradition, the long history of Judaism, teaching that same set of virtues generation after generation, Christianity coming along and purifying those virtues in another direction. And again, generation after generation, what does this do to the psychology? Well, it creates a different kind of moral psychology altogether. And Nietzsche thinks it's quite unhealthy, quite sick. And so he wants to argue here, particularly about priests who are typically a little more intelligent, a little more ambitious than the usual sheep-like follower of a religion. they recognize their impotence, right? And that they are trying to make themselves impotent, right? You know, chastity as a virtue. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. The truly great haters in the world history have always been priests. And then Nietzsche at other points generalizes this into the 19th century, also people who are socialists, right, and Democrats and anti-Semites and so forth, all of the people who seem to be really driven by a sense of hatred, of impotence, of not really liking who they are, looking for scapegoats and finding any sneaky way to destroy their betters and the creations of their betters. That's the psychology that Nietzsche is interested in. Now, this, of course, is the morality of altruism. Nietzsche colloquially calls it a slave morality, but it's the morality that says you should not be thinking about yourself. What you want doesn't matter. You should be selfless. And you just take that literally. The self is less. Less than what? Well, less than others. You should be a servant. You should serve others. You should be willing to sacrifice yourself for the sake of others. You should be obedient. You should be forgiving and so forth. So all of that, right, as a moral code that we colloquially can call an altruistic, right, moral code, Nietzsche now has then a interesting thesis about it. What he wants to argue is that this moral code actually is a kind of egoism. That then is to say, it is serving the interests of a certain sort of being. If in fact you are a weakling, whether you're now naturally a weakling because you were born in a certain lineage, or you were moderately, but you've come to be conditioned by and to accept a certain amount, a moral code that leads you to suppress yourself and not develop your capacities, and you become a conformist and a weakest. If in fact you are that kind of person, nonetheless, you still want to survive, and you still want to survive, but as a weakling. Well, then what kind of moral code is going to be good for you is precisely altruism. Because what does altruism do? Well, it does a lot of things. It then says, to the extent that you advocate altruism and other people accept the altruism, it means that everybody's going to hang together and look after each other. It says join right together in a group so that we can all look after. Because you know, as a weakling, the idea that you have to be independent and go off and start your own business or make your own way in the world, that's too scary and frightening. This idea of everybody in the same boat and looking after each other in some sort of a communal way, that's appealing to you. And to the extent that you can get other people to sign on to it, that's to your interest. They will look after you. And of course, if you're a weakling, you don't want to go off in the world by yourself because you're afraid of the predators. You're afraid of the strong. You're going to get beaten up. And so part of altruism is this herd morality element. There's safety in number. So the more that you surround yourself by other people who are just like you, there's safety in numbers. And so that then is to say altruism is the egoism of the weak in that sense as well. Of course, it's useful also as a weapon against people who are stronger than you, because to the extent that you can advocate altruism and you can get them and other people who are advocating altruism to get richer people and smarter people and beautiful people and adventuresome people to feel a little bit ashamed or guilty, or that they don't deserve their position in life, then they will, of course, be less likely to take advantage of you. It will be demoralizing. It's a weapon against the stronger to weaken them psychologically so that they don't use their strength in a way that might be threatening to you. And of course, if you can get them to feel guilty for having more stuff, more riches, right, and so forth, then they might, out of charity, share with you. And then, of course, that's to your advantage as well. So the idea then is, and this is what Nietzsche is arguing, morality is not about truth or falsity, right? Morality is about usefulness. right? What's actually useful to enable us to assert our interests in the world and to express, right, who we are. But of course, he then adds to that, who you are and what your interests are depends on what kind of human being you are. And he doesn't think that we are all unitary in our human nature, that biologically and psychologically, we are arrayed along a spectrum, but a lot of people are clumped at one end, what he calls the slave psychology, the weakling, the physiologically unhealthy spectrum. And so their interests are quite different from the interests of people who are toward the other end of the spectrum, those who are strong and vigorous and adventuresome and have the sense that life should be a romantic quest and to go out and they want to do their own creative thing in the world. Those are two different kinds of human beings. They have two different sets of interests. And so the interests of the weaklings are, in fact, to have a certain kind of moral code that affirms that they're the good guys, that it's okay to be sheep-like, it's okay to be weak and forgiving and obedient. And to the extent that that moral code can be more prominent in the world, they are safer, they're more looked after, and the other people are less of a threat and are more likely then to become the servants of the weaker people as well. So this is a very striking thesis, and I'd like us to keep this one in mind when we turn to Rand, because this is going to be one of the things that Rand disagrees with quite significantly, even though certain significant elements of the Nietzschean analysis that we've presented so far, Rand would agree with it. Now, one of the things that is very interesting about Nietzsche is that the interests that are served are not just physiological interests or not just physical interests, that we need material goods, so we want money, or we need physical protection as well. He also argues that moral codes, in addition to being a psychological expression of who you are and what your aspirations are, that they also push other psychological buttons, that every human being naturally, whenever he feels aggrieved or threatened or having been treated wrongly, wants revenge. That's natural. But if you are a weak person, then of course, you're going to at some point know that you are a weak person. And you're going to get beaten up on and pushed around, right, by people who are stronger, right, and better than you. And that's going to do nasty things to you psychologically, right? It dehumanizes you even further. And of course, you don't like yourself to the extent that you realize that you are a weakling being pushed around by other people in the world. But what we do is we don't want to admit to ourselves that there's anything wrong with us, that we are bad. And so what we try to do is we try to rationalize this in various ways. It's not my fault that I'm bad. It's the world that's against me, right? Or the rules of the game are rigged against me. It's those bad people who have put me in this terrible situation. And so you feel this real strong sense of resentment and anger at the world, and of course those who are in a better position than you. And what you want is a kind of revenge against those people and sometimes against the whole world itself. But of course you're not going to get it because you're a weakling. So what you do, and this is one of the things that religious moralities provide as a psychological value, is you project this idea that there's not only this life, your life sucks in the here and now, but in the afterlife, there's heaven and there's hell. But because you were weak and oppressed and you suffered, you're one of the ones who's going to get to go to heaven. So there's a kind of consolation prize. It's a psychological value that comes along here. But even better, when you go to heaven, aside from having this nice, powerful God who's going to look after everything for you, there's going to be this one great benefit. You're going to get revenge on your betters, all those strong, rich, beautiful people who lived the good life while your life sucked in the real world. And so what is interesting, and this is Nietzsche quoting Thomas Aquinas, one of the great heroes in the Christian religious tradition, who quite explicitly says, one of the great things about going to heaven is going to be that we'll be up there in heaven, and all of those bad people who were rich and powerful and conquerors and so forth, they're going to go to hell, and God is going to punish them. And we get to watch how they suffer in hell. And won't that be just so wonderful. So there's a kind of revenge fantasy that is built into this altruistic moral code as well. And of course, it's called justice, right? The good get their rewards, the bad get their punishment. But of course, the good people are the people who are the sheep-like ones or the slave-like ones, and the bad ones are the ones that are the opposite of that. And of course, it's not just Aquinas, it's also, you can find similar things in Augustine, you can find similar things in Tertullian and other earlier church fathers. Now, Nietzsche is extraordinarily concerned by this because he does see the great battle that we are facing in, at that point, to the 19th century, significantly into the modern world as a moral battle. It's a battle of ethical systems and the belief systems that go along with them. And what he's going to say is that the moral code is, you can write off the weaklings, write off the slaves. They're not going to do anything with their lives anyway. We don't really care about them, but they do have the potential to infect or poison or undercut those human beings who have some human potential to go on and do something significant in their lives. And so it's the use of altruism as a weapon against the better people. That's what Nietzsche is worried about. So here, the danger is that the slave morality will make the potentially strong feel miserable, malevolent against himself, full of hatred against the springs of life, full of suspicion against all that was still strong and happiness. So he's using this language of infection, right, against the better. So that's what the real threat is. And so that's why he wants to then go on to say, and in many cases, he says he's an immoralist or an anti-moralist, but what he means is that particular Judeo-Christian, but of course there are other versions of it, but in the West it's the Judeo-Christian tradition that's the strongest one, what he's calling the slave morality. Precisely morality, right, would be to blame if the highest power and splendor actually possible to the type man was never in fact attained. So that precisely morality is or was the danger of dangers. All right, I'm going to pause there and make a transition now to Ayn Rand and start to explore the ways in which she draws significantly on Nietzsche's account of altruism, and she is equally vehement in her antagonism toward it, but at the same time, there are some very important differences that, that need to be attended to do a fair comparison of these two giant thinkers. There are fundamental philosophical differences here. And the most important one is that for Rand, human beings are beings who are self-creating when it comes to their beliefs, their emotional set, and their policies of action. So her way rhetorically of putting it is to say that man is a being of self-made soul. And this is directly in contrast then to Nietzsche's view that we are instinctually created and that we are products of prior biological inheritances. Pushing Nietzsche, you get a strong form of biological determinism. Rand is a view, is an advocate of free will, of human beings being volitional, that we are in control of our minds, that we can shape our emotions, we can shape our actions, that we are in control. As a result, we can decide, and upon identifying what's good and bad objectively, decide that we're going to believe that and then become the kind of people who are committed to that. But then, of course, equally, we can decide not to engage in that process. We can decide just to turn our minds off and just lazily accept whatever happens to be out there. Or we can let our fears get the better of us and become cowardly kinds of people. And so over the course of time, we can make ourselves by default often. Of course, sometimes we can choose things that we know are short-term indulgences, but long-term undercut our capacity to be strong and healthy and fit and so forth. So we become possibly cowardly, lazy, soft people who know that we have made ourselves into the kinds of beings who are not able really to face life's challenges. So What you become, particularly by the time of the adult, is up to you. You are deeply self-responsible. Every human being is deeply self-responsible, and human beings choose to become good, or they choose to become bad, or they choose to become some sort of mixture. And then particularly by the time we are adults and we reflect on who we are, some of us feel pride, we feel self-esteem because we know what went into becoming the kind of person with the accomplishments that we have. And other people, by the time we become adults, we really do feel humble, we feel ashamed, we feel a little bit guilty, and we don't really like who we are, and we might even in extreme cases come to hate ourselves and be filled with self-loathing because we know, not in an all at one time make a big choice, but rather over the course of lots of little decisions we added up to making ourselves the underachieving person that we are. So for Rand, the point is that morality is the deepest phenomenon. We are beings who have the capacity for choice, and we have a capacity for reason to identify facts about human nature and about the world that we live in, and we have self-responsibility. So that then is to say that she believes that human beings are all the same in this general way, and so there should be one moral code for all human beings, one general set of principles that are true, that are rational, that we can all identify, and we all have the capacity to inculcate the same virtues. So it's not the case against Nietzsche that there are different kinds of human beings, and each of them psychologically is not really able to reason, but rather it's just reason is just after the fact rationalization. So while Rand believes that we have choice, fundamentally Nietzsche does not. While Rand believes that we rationally identify facts and can base a moral code on the basis of that, Nietzsche believes that reason is just an after-the-fact rationalization. While Rand believes that there is one general moral code, one set of principles, values, and virtues for all human beings to live up to, Nietzsche believes that there are relativized moral codes depending on the kinds of beings, right, that one is. So those are some very fundamental differences. Now, when it comes to altruism, though, what is different is that Nietzsche is typically going to then use the language of healthy and unhealthy. You know, if you're just born with a sickly nature, it's not really your fault, so we don't moralistically diagnose you. But for Rand, she's going to not just use language of sickness and health, she's also going to use languages of moral and immoral. That is deeper for her. So that's another fundamental difference as well. Now, Rand does interestingly also make some historical points. When she was an undergraduate at university, she was a history major. And on this issue, she also makes an interesting claim that there is some understandableness to altruism being a historical moral code. When she argues that before the Industrial Revolution, for example, when life really was a subsistence level, hard to do things, it was very difficult for people consistently to be individuals and to be egoists and to have their own goals and so forth. So she says here, it's obvious why the morality of altruism is a tribal phenomenon. Prehistorical men were physically unable to survive, right, without clinging to a tribe for leadership and protection against other tribes. So we did need leaders. We did need to obey. We did need to be subordinate. We did need to be part of the herd because functioning as an individual, it seems, was important. But then she wants to argue that the cause of altruism's perpetuation into civilized eras is not then physical, because now we have the physical tools, we have the physical resources, we have the knowledge to function as individuals, and to the extent that we do so, everything improves. So rather it's a hangover psychologically, or it's a psychoepistemological point. People do not grow up psychologically, they do not grow up morally and accept that full responsibility. Instead, she uses psychological language here, human beings are of arrested development, they remain at a perceptual level and so forth. And so to the extent that you do remain a kind of child psychologically, it is going to be a felt psychological need for some people to adopt some sort of altruistic, we're all part of the herds, let's all share with each other, let's all look after each other. And any sort of individualism is still psychologically going to seem different. But it's not a point about human nature, it's about abdication by some individuals of their moral capacity and their moral responsibility to grow to full adult. Now, what's interesting, particularly in The Fountainhead, her first great moral piece of literature, there are any number of strains of altruism and manifestations that she's articulating, particularly in the characters of Peter Keating and the great villain Ellsworth Toohey. So Toohey, for example, is a great union organizer. He's talking about hanging together and mutual self-support, right, and so forth. Toohey also fairly regularly is making the arguments about how the world is divided into the weak and the strong, and that the weaker need to get together and band against the strong. There's safety in numbers. And he also is making the argument that if we advocate, right, this altruistic philosophy, and we can get the strong, particularly the government, to say that the strong have an obligation to support the weak, well, then the strong and the rich people will give us all sorts of stuff, and that will be good for us as well. So all of these are similar to the sorts of themes that Nietzsche had earlier sounded as well. And then, of course, to the extent that one can advocate successfully altruism and get people to believe it, then this morality is a tool that you can use to control other people. That we're all interested in power from this Toohey perspective, which is another kind of Nietzschean perspective, that morality of altruism is very good at gaining control over other people. So jumping ahead to the Fountainhead, or sorry, to Atlas Shrugged, for example, there's a very interesting scene. Those of you who've read the novel might recall Hank Rearden and Francisco d'Anconia, right, are at a party, and Rearden is, of course, contemptuously and dismissively looking at the large number of moochers and hangers-on who are at his party and who make up much of broader society. And Francisco is warning him. He's saying, you're in a battle and you don't quite realize what the battle is. And the battle actually is a moral battle. It's not about material technology. It's not about wealth. It's not even primarily about politics. And Rearden is kind of dismissive. He's saying, a battle? What battle? I hold the whip hand. Right? I'm the rich, powerful, multi-industrialist. I don't fight this disarmed. When he looks at these people, they seem so weak and pathetic. And then Francisco says, are they? They have a weapon against you. It's their only weapon, but it's a terrible weapon. Ask yourself what it is sometime. And of course, it's the moral code of altruism and its offshoots, collectivism and pity and guilt, right? And so forth. And this, if we jump back to the Fountainhead, is one thing that she has her villain Toohey confess toward the end of the novel, where Toohey, of course, is about power, but he's not able to get power through wealth and physical assertiveness. Instead, he's very effectively using philosophy, particularly morality, as a weapon against. What's the real lever that's going to enable you to control people? And he goes on to say, it's not whips or swords or fire or guns or even money. It's not the weapons of Caesar and Attila and Napoleon. It's the soul. You have to break people's soul. And what he means is people's independence, their assertiveness, their sense of adventure, their sense that their life matters and that they should go off and do their own things. He wants people to be subordinate. And then he goes on to itemize the kinds of tools, make people feel small. You're really pathetic, you're sinful, you should be ashamed of yourself. That you should be selfless, but then of course to the extent that people then indulge themselves at any point, they feel guilty and that undermines them and so forth. Altruism as this ideal, it really is impracticable, but if people believe that it's an ideal and then fail to live up to it, then that's going to break their internal sense of integrity and self-esteem, and those kinds of people you can control. That's what's going to give you power over them. And then, of course, if you have power over them, then those people you really hate and dislike and despise, that you are resentful against, then you can destroy them. And then in this case, we know Toohey hates Howard Roark because Howard Roark is a man of great integrity and independence and creative genius, something that Toohey knows he cannot live up to, but what he actually wants is to see that guy broken. The idea of Howard Roark in jail, that's that dark revenge fantasy that Toohey has, and everything is going to enable him to do so. And then we do know that there's all sorts of nihilists out there, jumping back to a Nietzsche quote. They see the world out there and all of these magnificent accomplishments, but for whatever reason, they feel that they are failures in their own lives. And that self-condemnation just does horrible things inside, and rather than admit that they are the failures and resolving to fix themselves and try again, they would rather just blow up the whole world and destroy everything rather than admit that they are wrong. And this rhetoric that we find in Nietzsche's Dawn or Daybreak is also picked up in Toohey and some of the other later villains in Rand's novels as well. And then once again, the quotation from Aquinas, but it is interesting that you find the same sentiment announced in Tertullian, an early church father, St. Augustine, Jonathan Edwards, the Great Awakening religious thinker, and so forth. The idea that we are opponents of the strong, the rich, and the powerful, and we see the world in a great battle between them, but we're on the side of the weak and the helpless. And we just hope that there's a great, powerful, and angry, vengeful God who's going to get our revenge for us in the afterlife, so that we can get our true bliss. And what that true bliss will be, being up in heaven where we don't have to do anything, rather everything is just automatically provided for us. But at the same time, we can see our hated enemies demeaned, destroyed, suffering, tormented, and so forth. That's what we really want. All right, I'm going to summarize in 1 minute and then go to some questions. I've saved 10 minutes for that. And I know that, or I hope rather, that we'll return for the formal Q&A session. Let things mull over in your mind, and perhaps this has prompted some more questions. We'll be able to have a whole Q&A session devoted to a deeper dive into a lot of these issues as well. So just on this theme of Nietzsche and Rand on altruism, which is our focus today, there really is a lot of similarity. Nietzsche is, as Rand is, an extraordinarily perceptive psychologist of decay, of weakness. Both of them do see morality in functional terms. And they do, in many cases, see morality, particularly false moralities, as serving the interests of people who are not necessarily healthy. And we need to understand that psychological decay, and then particularly not give a moral sanction to those who are representing an unhealthy and disgusting moral code from Nietzsche's perspective, and from Rand's perspective, one, of course, that it is disgusting and repulsive, but more fundamentally, from her perspective, not true. But then at the same time, I do want to point out that there are some fundamentally important differences in their analyses. That for Rand, morality is a matter of choice. We do have volition. Friedrich Nietzsche does not believe that human beings have volition or free will. He advocates a fairly strong form of biological determinism. This is consistent over many of his works. I can provide quotations for that. So for him, it's a matter of determination rather than a matter of choice. So as a result of that, Nietzsche is willing to argue that human beings have evolved into different substrains of human beings, whereas for Rand, we are all one species, all with the same core capacities. It's as a matter of choice that we become psychologically different, not a matter of biological necessity. So for Rand, there should be one universal moral code that we recognize by choice. For Nietzsche, there really is a deep relativism at work there. And then finally, the language that they use, Rand is consistently going to use moralistic language. If you adopt altruism and you become that kind of person and you act on the basis of them, well, that is an abdication of moral responsibility. If you instead choose and embody healthy values, that's a moral achievement. You should be praised, the other people should be blamed. And as a result, on the other side, Nietzsche, because of his position, he wants to argue that we shouldn't really be using moralistic language. Instead, we should just use that language and set it aside. We want to go kind of beyond good and evil. That's not quite what he means there, but rather we should just see them as healthy and unhealthy, or as disgusting, or as aesthetically admirable, but not using any sort of moralistic language. Okay, I'm going to stop there formally and go now to the questions that have been posted. I will now need to switch over to the ThinkSpot screen. I've been at the Zoom screen right now, so please give me a moment to get there.
Sorry, Stephen, we have some questions also in the Zoom, if you have time to answer them.
Okay. Why don't, what is your recommendation then, Maria? Should I go to the Zoom questions, or should I go to the ThinkSpot questions first? Which one should get precedence?
You go for Zoom, and let's go after that to, sorry, let's go to ThinkSpot questions and then Zoom question, if it's okay for you.
All right. All right, I see one question at Zoom: morality connecting with religion necessarily, from Jacqueline Isabel. Okay, I'll take that one. Yeah, both Nietzsche and Rand would say no to that. Broadly speaking, what they want to argue is that religious morality is one type of morality, but it's not the case that actually, if you don't believe in God, you cannot be moral. Both of them want to argue that there is no God, that morality depends either, in the case of Rand, on certain facts of external nature in relation to facts of human nature, and that morality should be a scientific enterprise, not a religious enterprise. Nietzsche wants to argue that morality is a subjective creation. It's a projection of, or a rationalization of, underlying drive. So for both of them, there is no necessary connection to religion. Okay, now there's another one from Jonathan from Moronis. About Nietzsche's determinism, we can say a kind of inherited Schopenhauer philosophy of the will, despite later he denied this influence. Well, yes and no. Yes, certainly Nietzsche is deeply influenced by Schopenhauer. One difference is a kind of a teleological difference, that for Schopenhauer, the will is irrational, and it's not going in any particular direction. It's just seething and out of control, and it can be anything, and it's completely unpredictable what those manifestations are going to be. Nietzsche, by contrast, wants to argue that the will is directional, that there's a kind of telos, or there's a sorting out that's going on. So you can see all of history as a kind of cosmic drama, or a struggle that is being worked out. So in this respect, he is incorporating, I want to say, some element of Hegel as well. So he wants to say will to power, but power is directional. And so we are necessarily evolving towards something, and he hopes it's going to be the overman. So that ties into a question from Eloy Vera. One of Nietzsche's best known concepts is the Übermensch, or the Superman. Would you say that Rand has a similar concept to describe her heroes or ideal men as portrayed? I want to say no, absolutely not. They are very, very different, all for reasons that we'll be getting into in much detail in the second lecture, where we turn to their positive What do they then think if we shouldn't be altruistic? What should we be? What does egoism mean for both of them? But just quickly, for Nietzsche, Nietzsche does have a very conflict-driven understanding. It really is predator versus prey understanding of human beings. And of course, it's also the predators against the other predators. And so he's quite explicitly in favor of arguing for the domination, even the outright slavery of some human beings to another in order to create the Übermensch. Whereas for Rand, she entirely rejects any sort of slavery, any sort of domination of some people over the others. We should be independent. We should create our own lives, create our own values, and we should respect other people's rights to engage in their own independent creative projects as well. That's just one quick thing. There are several other fundamental differences, but we'll have to save that for next time. From Karen Romero, is morality linked to our actual situation, or is it inherited by the ones who raised us? For Nietzsche, it's a blending of the both of those, right? He does want to argue that the impulses and the instincts, we inherit them, and in some cases, all we do is just kind of rationalize, or we project and adopt a morality that makes us feel good or comfortable inside our skin, given whatever it is. But he does have a kind of a Lamarckian evolutionary view, if you know something about the history, that over time, it is possible for cultural influences, depending on actual situations, to change human beings biologically. So for Nietzsche, it's going to be a more complicated interplay. For Rand, she's much more universalistic. Morality is not based on our actual situation. It doesn't matter if you're born rich or poor, or if you're born in the mountains or in the sea, there are going to be the same general principles. And it's not a matter of inheritance from your parents biologically. Rather, it's just that human beings are human beings. We all have the same general physiological nature, the same general psychological nature, the same capacity for independent thought, independent action in the world. So she's much more generalist and universalist. Okay, let me now go to the Think Spot. We'll go to watch. I know there are some questions here. Oh my goodness, now the same capacity for independent thought, independent action in the world. So she's much more generalist and universalist. Okay, let me now go to I'm running into one technical issue here. That when I turn my Think Spot on, I get the delay. The same capacity for independent thought, independent action in the world. So she's much more generalist and universalist. Okay, let me now go to I'm running into one technical issue here. That when I turn my Think Spot on, I get the delay. The same capacity. All right, since I'm running into small technical difficulty, I'm going to extend this a little longer. So I know there's lots of good questions. I don't want to penalize anyone for the technical issues at this end. So let me go to the questions here. Okay, so I'm going to take them in order. Question from Bradola came in. Rand personifies Nietzsche's Superman in Wynand in her novel The Fountainhead. Do you agree? And if so, do you think that Rand came to reject Nietzsche, right, and so forth? Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, Gail Wynand in The Fountainhead is a very Nietzschean character and explicitly modeled on that. But it is important, of course, that Rand sees Gail Wynand as a tragic figure, as a flawed figure. When we first meet the guy, he's on the verge of committing suicide. And over the course, because his life feels empty at a fairly fundamental level. And then as he meets Rourke and initially tries to destroy Rourke, Rourke being the creative, independent Rand hero, he comes more consciously to realize the differences. So it's exactly the differences between Howard Roark and Gail Wynand. And so Roark is Rand's philosophical attempt to supersede the Nietzschean framework. Yeah, very, very good. From Cameron, Nietzsche on women. Oh my goodness, yes. Well, I want to say, yeah, 1/3 of the time, I think, there's not really anything we can learn about women from Nietzsche. In some respects, he's certainly a man of his time. A certain amount of it, I think, is just a certain, teasingness that women do with respect to each other, poking fun at their stereotypical differences and so forth. But I do really think there is a 19th century old-fashioned sexism in Nietzsche, and it's one that Rand entirely rejects. So I would say, yeah, don't go to Nietzsche to learn anything about women. And I'm not going to get biographical about his actual successes or not with women. Are the producers in Atlas Shrugged demonstrating Ayn Rand's plan for objectivists when dealing with the world bent on collective altruism? In the novel, yes, that is the device, right? The producers, the creative people, the people who do not buy into the self-sacrificing altruist moral code, they go on strike. And that then is to say, if a fundamental principle of social morality is that our transactions should be mutually beneficial, right, or win-win, but you're creating a moral culture and a political culture that is going to require us to be self-sacrificial animals and serve you without getting due reward. Well, we're not going to play that game. We are going to withdraw. Now, if the question is stepping outside the novel and assessing our own circumstance, should we go on strike now, given all of the patheticness and outright depravity in the world? I think that's another question. I'm, I think, more optimistic about that. But let me save that, because that's a deep question requiring an assessment of the current moral and political climate, and then questions about the values that one should live in your own life. So there's a lot of unpacking that would be necessary. So let me save that one for the full Q&A session in 2 weeks from now. Another question here coming from Shiva Sankar, if I'm pronouncing that question. At what point does the kind of egoism Nietzsche and Rand talk of tilt toward unhealthy self-obsession and arrogance, which more often can do more damage? Nietzsche himself ended up almost bitter and alone toward the end, right, although his work was great. Yeah, all right, so that's an interesting question. I think in one sense, if the question is, egoism is about self-assertion, dreaming big dreams, going for it, thinking well of yourself, loving yourself, how much of that is too much? I think probably the answer for Rand would be to say there is no upper limit. It's kind of like saying, how much is being too rich, right? Or how much is having too much sex in your life? How much love, at what point do you have too much love in your life, right? And so forth. And so if these are genuine values, the more you can pack of those into your life, right, the better. But there is, of course, an issue of arrogance and unhealthy self-assertion and so on. And I think those are, in most cases, either a misassessment of oneself, that it's not simply the case that you just take whatever it is that you happen to value and you go for it. First, you have to properly identify what are healthy values for yourself. So self-assertion in the service of what you think are values, but really are unhealthy values, that of course can be self-destructive. And while we say, of course, it's important to be a dreamer and to dream big dreams, that has to be tied to an assessment of your actual capacity. So, I'm 6 feet tall. When I was a kid, I wanted to play in the National Basketball Association, and I wanted to grow up to be 6'6". Well, if I'm going to have that as a dream, but it's unrealistic given my actual height, well, that then is a self-destructive self-assertiveness. If I'm just telling myself, no, I'm going to make it in the NBA. And now that I'm a middle-aged guy, if I suddenly say, oh no, I'm going to become a professional basketball player, that's my new goal. Well, again, that would be a self-delusional dream as well. So that sort of arrogance or assertiveness tied to an inappropriate assessment would be wrong. Also, tying into this question, in many cases, self-assertiveness and arrogance are in a social context, in the way some people feel the need to assert themselves is by overriding and stepping on others. And to the extent that you are inappropriately doing that, well, then you need to rein yourself in, because you have to recognize that your self-assertiveness has to coexist with other people's right to self-assertiveness, and we need to work out proper boundary lines between what's yours and what's mine, or what's your zone of action, right, and so on. And in psychological forms, for many people, they like to build themselves up by putting other people down. So, if I get a good grade on my mathematics test, rather than just saying, hey, I got a good grade on my math test, I feel proud of that. The kind of person who says, I got a good grade on my math test and I feel good because I got a better grade than you did. So my bragging is at the expense of you, and that all is unhealthy as well. As for Nietzsche's biography and the sad story about what happened to him at the end, let's save that right for another time. From Ralph Blanchett, does Rand's egoism require that an individual's long-term interests be concretely and demonstrably furthered by respecting the interests of others, which is to say by respecting their rights? Or can Rand's egoism accommodate what are called moralized interests, meaning that she would view conforming to abstract moral rules as also being in one's long-term interest? Okay, I'm not sure yet of the contrast. This is the first time I'm reading this. Moralized interests. I think what Rand does want to argue as an empiricist is that one's interests, right, one identifies what those are, and that one does go up a level of abstraction, and one's interests, when they fall into certain categories, should be adopted as abstracted principles. And of course, then you detail what the interests are in particular circumstances as one goes along. And so moralized interests do become long-term moral principles, unless I'm missing the point of your question here. But yes, as a general principle, she does want to argue, you're an individual, you're a rational individual, I'm an individual, I'm a rational individual. We both have the capacity for creative productiveness in the world, and it is a matter of my self-interest that I be free to do so, and that is to say that you are respecting my right to do so. But it's also to your interest that I be free to do so, because whatever it is that I'm interested in doing, I'm a musician, so I'm going to go off and create music, or I'm a philosopher, or I'm a technological person, and so on, to the extent that I am producing value in the world that is of interest to you. And then the same thing is symmetrical for me with respect to you. To the extent that you, for example, try to say, not respect my interests, say, in an extreme case, you want to make me a slave. Well, I'm not going to be nearly as creative or productive, so that, you're making me a slave is not going to serve your long-term interests. So if we imagine, suppose any of us had tried to make Thomas Edison or Steve Jobs a slave, and we made him a slave, well, we would have missed out on huge amounts of productivity. So respecting other people's creativity and their productivity is to our mutual self-interest. So as a long-term principle as well. And then Ralph, in the second part of your question, there is about honesty in particular. So we do have a principle of honesty. What I would say is, and now I'm speaking with what I take to be Rand's voice here. Nietzsche, of course, would be an advocate of strategic lying, but Rand is an advocate of a fairly ruthless honesty. But the most general point about honesty is fidelity to the facts, not being dishonest with yourself. If there's a fact about the world, you need to be aware of that fact, particularly the ones that are directly related to your values, that you're not going to be successful as a matter of principle in the world by deluding yourself about what what the facts are. Now then, more specifically in social contexts, honesty does have a social manifestation. Under what circumstances does one tell the truth, or does one divulge certain things, or if people are asking you certain things, under what circumstances are you obliged to respond on the terms that they have set here. And I think Rand wants to say, well, at that point, you do need to introduce a distinction. If you're dealing with another person who's basically decent and basically honest, and the context within which you are operating is aiming at a mutually beneficial result, then the principles of ruthless honesty hold in that circumstance. In a situation, though, where the other person has made it into an adversarial circumstance, someone's trying to mug you or steal from you or damage you in some other way, if that person has subverted the conditions under which normal moral human interaction is going on, well, you don't owe that person a moral treatment in response. So if that person then can be dealt with by a lie, you can get that person out of your face to go away, then you're morally entitled to engage in a lie. That, though, is to say, lying or not is a more particular judgment you make within the context of a more broader commitment to honesty, because the honest thing is this person is a predator, or this person is not treating me appropriately. So in that respect, the honest thing is to recognize that you're dealing with a predator, and you have the right to do what you need to in order to protect yourself against a predator. And that's going to include deception in those particular cases. Okay, next question. I'm going to go for another, I think maybe 5 minutes or so. There's a video available, this is from Danielle Cavazos, where Ayn Rand herself discusses the differences between her and Nietzsche. I'm not sure I'm aware of this video, but I would be interested. One of the main differing points is her claim that in Nietzsche's view, one is born an Übermensch. However, I have met people who think this reading is wrong, and Nietzsche never claimed you are born into or destined to that condition. So this is a question then about Nietzsche. Again, I can save a longer answer to this for next time when we're talking about their positive views. But my view is that, yes, Nietzsche is more biologically deterministic, that the vast majority of people are just not born with the capacities to become anything special, particularly not anything Übermensch-like, that it is a matter of some special individuals are born once in a while, right? Whatever blend of genes, although he did not know about genes at his time, whatever biological forces sifting and weaving, coming together, will 1 in a million, 1 in a billion human beings create something special. It's going to be that individual that has the capacity to raise us toward the Übermensch. So I don't think it's a matter of that what Nietzsche thinks is you're a tabula rasa, or you've just got a lot of potential. And if you read Nietzsche, or you just read the right sorts of inspirational writings, you can make a decision and will yourself to become an Übermensch. I do think that's a faulty reading of Nietzsche. Whereas Rand, with her tabula rasa position, wants to, I think, argue that every human being born with natural capacities, if he or she consistently exercises those capacities, and then particularly when we're young, we get the psychological and the material support. We all have the potential for great creativity, maybe not the genius level, but great creativity, great independence, great capacity, and so on. So in that respect, Rand is much more universalistic about the potential of human beings, and Nietzsche's reputation for being an elitist is much more deserved. There's another question going back to Jonathan Mirus. You say Rand is getting close to the philosophical canon, but she's still not yet a real philosopher, maybe because her critics of the academy, you think, is really getting them, because here in Latin America, specifically Mexico, if you know, here she's like a crazy lady, not even worth the lecture. How is that changing in the Anglo-American? Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, in Latin America has a much more unhealthy, even diseased intellectual culture. There are some great, smart people in Latin America, but it's an unhealthy. So, I think it's a natural reaction that anyone like Ayn Rand, they would react quite negatively to her. In the Anglo-speaking world, it's, I think, a much more mixed bag. Rand is now much more regularly included in philosophical anthologies, particularly in textbooks, introduction to ethics and so forth, as representing a position as a distinctive position and so forth. At the major online encyclopedias of philosophy, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There are long written entries by scholars on her, so she's in the canon in that respect. And in most of the major published encyclopedias, there's a representation of Rand. So she is in the canon. Of course, she is a minority figure. She was not a Ph.D. in philosophy. She wasn't a professional philosopher. There's a certain amount of kind of academic snobbishness that professional philosophers only like to cite and acknowledge other professional philosophers. And so non-academics often have a harder road. But of course, Rand did not write a lot of nonfiction philosophers. She also is, in effect, like Nietzsche and Camus. Sorry, not Nietzsche, I meant to say Dostoevsky, primarily has a reputation for being a literary figure. And so that makes it harder for people to break into formal philosophical writings as well. And then, of course, there's just the contents of her views. Rand's an advocate of capitalism and free markets, and all of the surveys show that the vast majority of academics, particularly in the humanities, hate free markets and capitalism. And so from their perspective, they just have a vested political interest in not spending on any time at all on someone who might be making a powerful philosophical case. So it's business as usual. But just like Nietzsche was widely dismissed for a couple of generations, and Nietzscheans had to fight a hard-fought battle to get him into the canon. The same thing is happening to Rand. People who are brilliant, who have new arguments, and who have people of integrity and honesty willing to make the case for them, she'll get there. So I'm not too worried. All right, I'm showing 1:15, so we've run a little bit long. So I'm going to pause there. I invite everyone to come back next week, same time. We're going to do the same thing, but turn to Rand and Nietzsche and their positive advocacy of egoism. And then in 2 weeks, we will have a whole hour devoted just to Q&A. I know I didn't get to all of the other questions, and there are some that are still being posted as we speak. So I hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks again to Ayn Rand Center Latin America for co-hosting this. And thanks again to the team at ThinkSpot for making it possible. Goodbye for now.